Autumn in Willowbrook. The leaves had just begun to turn in Willowbrook. Soft shades of amber, gold, and burnt orange lined the narrow cobblestone streets, drifting gently from the tall maple trees with every breeze. The air was crisp but not cold, touched with the scent of wood smoke and fresh bread from the bakery on Main Street. At the edge of the village, nestled between a cluster of trees and a winding stream, sat a small cottage with green shutters and a stone chimney. This cottage belonged to Eleanor. Eleanor had lived in Willowbrook for over 30 years. She wasn't born there, but she always said the village felt like a place she had been dreaming of long before she arrived. Every autumn, she decorated her front steps with pumpkins and dried corn husks, placing a woven blanket over the old rocking chair where she spent her mornings sipping tea. Each day began with quiet rituals. She would wake just after sunrise, when the fog still clung to the fields like a sleeping cat. She lit a small fire in the hearth, boiled water in a copper kettle, and opened the window just a little to let in the crisp morning air. Outside, the village stirred slowly. The baker, Mr. Callum, would open his shutters with a yawn and begin kneading dough. The distant sound of his radio playing soft jazz drifted across the rooftops. A flock of birds would gather near the town square's old fountain, chirping as if catching up after the night. Eleanor often strolled to the market with a wicker basket in hand. The path led past hedgerows still heavy with blackberries, past the old library with its ivy-covered walls, and past the bridge where children tied ribbons to the railing, each one a whispered wish. She always stopped at Maeve's flower stall. Maeve was a retired schoolteacher who now sold dried bouquets and tiny jars of lavender honey. The two women would chat about the weather, the birds, and the kinds of clouds they'd seen that morning, never in a rush. One particular morning, Eleanor noticed the hush in the air felt a little different. Not quieter, exactly, just deeper. The kind of silence that wrapped around you like a blanket. She paused on her walk and looked up. A V formation of geese passed overhead, calling out as they went. The sound echoed across the hills, then faded, leaving only the wind moving through the trees. Willowbrook was preparing for its harvest festival. Banners of burgundy and gold were being strung between lamp posts. Children practiced their lines for the play they would perform in the town hall. And in the evenings, the scent of cinnamon, baked apples, and mulled cider filled the air. Eleanor volunteered to help at the pie table. She spent her afternoons in the kitchen, peeling apples by the dozen, humming old tunes as the smell of cinnamon and nutmeg filled her cottage. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the village in warm honeyed light, Eleanor took a break. She sat on her porch with a mug of tea, wrapped in her shawl. The wind carried the faint sound of laughter and fiddles from the rehearsal in the square. She thought about how, year after year, the seasons turned so gently in Willowbrook. Nothing loud. Nothing rushed. Just the quiet rhythm of a place that understood how to breathe. That evening, she wrote a letter to her niece who lived in the city. She described the leaves, the pies, the lanterns being hung along the main road. She said, "You must come visit before the first frost. Autumn here is something you feel in your bones. It's not just the colors, it's the pace of it all. How the days ask nothing of you except to notice them." As night fell, candles flickered in cottage windows. The village grew still. Crickets began their slow song. And Eleanor, curled in her chair, drifted into sleep with the soft crackle of the fire beside her. The next morning, Eleanor awoke to the sound of gentle rain tapping on the roof tiles. It wasn't a hard rain, just a soft, steady drizzle that made everything smell clean and earthy. She pulled her wool cardigan tighter around her shoulders, lit a candle on the kitchen table, and watched as droplets slid slowly down the windowpane. The village looked as though it were wrapped in gauze, softened by mist and morning silence. From her window, Eleanor could see the smoke rising from Mr. Callum's bakery, curling into the gray sky like ribbons. It would be a good day to stay indoors, she thought, a day for slow things. She gathered her knitting from the basket by the armchair and settled into her usual spot near the fireplace. The warmth of the flames and the quiet tick of the old clock on the wall were the only sounds in the room. Her hands moved rhythmically, the needles clicking softly, forming rows of a blanket she'd been working on for weeks. Around midday, the rain lightened, and a beam of sun broke through the clouds. The leaves on the trees shimmered, each drop of water catching the light like a jewel. Eleanor opened the door just a little and let the fresh, rain-scented air drift in. She decided to walk to the bookshop. Putting on her boots and wrapping a scarf around her neck, she stepped onto the damp path that led toward the heart of Willowbrook. The village was quiet, most people staying in on such a day, but she liked it this way. Every puddle reflected a perfect, miniature world. The soft squish of her steps was oddly satisfying. The bookshop, Thistle and Page, was tucked between the post office and a tiny shop that sold handmade candles. Inside, the smell of old pages and beeswax filled the air. The owner, an elderly gentleman named Arthur, greeted her with a nod and a smile. He always wore the same burgundy sweater and round glasses perched low on his nose. "Rainy day stories, eh?" he said, motioning toward the back, where a small reading nook waited with overstuffed chairs and a kettle for tea. Eleanor wandered the shelves slowly, her fingers tracing the spines of books she had already read and loved. She pulled down a collection of autumn poems and another about quiet gardens. Before settling in the reading nook, she poured herself a cup of chamomile from the shop's teapot and added a sugar cube that melted like snow. Time passed unnoticed. Outside, the clouds began to break apart, letting in long streams of afternoon sunlight. The village glowed. Patches of wet stone sparkled. Raindrops clung to the windows like scattered pearls. Back home, Eleanor placed her books on the table and lit a few candles. She took out her old recipe journal, a leather-bound notebook with soft, worn pages, and flipped to a page titled, "Pear and Ginger Tart." As she baked, the warm scent filled her cottage. The pears caramelized just enough to bring out their sweetness, and the ginger added a comforting heat. She thought of bringing a few slices to Maeve and perhaps one to Arthur, who always insisted he didn't have a sweet tooth, yet never turned down a slice of pie. As evening approached, the village began preparing for the upcoming festival. Down by the community barn, lights were being strung across the beams. Hay bales were stacked into little seating areas, and jars of candles were placed along the paths. Children ran back and forth with ribbons, while parents stirred pots of cider over outdoor fires. Laughter and voices echoed gently into the hills. Eleanor visited the barn briefly to drop off a basket of tarts. She stayed just long enough to hear the fiddlers practicing a soft tune, one that made the heart ache in the gentlest way. Then she returned home, her boots crunching over drying leaves. Later that night, wrapped in her blanket with the wind brushing softly against the windows, Eleanor thought of how every autumn in Willowbrook felt slightly different, yet deeply familiar. It wasn't just the sights or the scents or the sounds. It was something deeper. A kind of knowing. A reminder that slowing down wasn't falling behind, it was finally catching up. She wrote in her journal, "The trees speak softly here. The wind carries memories. And the days ask for nothing but your attention." Then, with the fire burning low and the candles flickering one by one, Eleanor closed her eyes, and sleep came easily. The morning after the rain, the sun rose with unusual brilliance. A thin mist hovered over the meadows, glowing in the light like silk draped across the land. Birds had returned to their morning posts, perched on garden fences, singing as if rehearsing a quiet symphony only Willowbrook could hear. Eleanor stood on her back porch with a cup of steaming tea. The garden behind her cottage, now glistening from the rainfall, looked like a painting, fallen leaves resting gently over the grass, tiny mushrooms blooming beneath the hedges, and the little wooden bench under the willow tree still damp with dew. She decided it was the perfect day for a walk beyond the village. There was an old path, narrow and winding, that led up to a hill known as Blackberry Ridge. The locals rarely went up anymore, not because it was far, but because life kept most of them busy closer to the village. But Eleanor liked the solitude. She packed a small thermos of tea and a notebook, wrapped a thick scarf around her neck, and set off with slow, deliberate steps. The trail welcomed her like an old friend. Leaves crunched underfoot, and the occasional squirrel darted through the underbrush. Along the path were wild asters and faded rosehips, and further along, a wooden gate hung slightly open. Beyond it, The hill sloped gently upward through golden grasses and quiet wind. When she reached the top, Eleanor sat on a large flat rock and took in the view. From here, Willowbrook looked like something out of a storybook. Chimneys puffed thin trails of smoke. The rooftops shimmered with morning light. The trees surrounding the village glowed in every shade of autumn: copper, amber, rust, and flame. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, and then all was still again. Eleanor sipped her tea and opened her notebook. She began writing, not anything in particular, just thoughts, sensations, small details the day had offered her. She wrote about the scent of the damp earth, the way the light shifted through the trees, the sound of dry leaves rustling like whispers from the past. She wrote about her mother's garden, long gone, and how autumn had always reminded her of home, not a place, but a feeling. She stayed there for an hour, maybe more. Time didn't announce itself in Willowbrook. It moved gently, like the breeze. When she finally stood to leave, she felt lighter, as if something she hadn't known she was carrying had been set down. That afternoon, she returned to the village and stopped by the town square, where preparations for the festival were nearly complete. Children were practicing their lantern parade, holding glass jars with candles inside, tied with twine and autumn leaves. The lanterns swayed as they walked in slow loops, their tiny faces glowing with excitement. Eleanor smiled and greeted a few familiar faces. Maeve handed her a small bundle wrapped in wax paper, clove and apple biscuits. "Still warm," Maeve said with a wink. "For later." By sunset, the sky turned a deep shade of plum, and the clouds glowed like cinders. Eleanor walked back to her cottage as golden light streamed through the tree branches. The wind carried the scent of pine and spice, and a few early stars twinkled shyly overhead. That evening, she lit her oil lamp and placed the warm biscuits on a plate. She turned on the old radio in her kitchen, where soft classical music filled the space like falling leaves. She sat by the window, looking out as the sky deepened to navy and shadows stretched long over the land. Later, she wrote again. "Today I remembered what stillness feels like. The kind that fills you, not empties you. The kind that holds you steady without saying a word." Sleep found her easily that night. And as she drifted off, the last thing she heard was the wind in the trees, whispering old songs through the branches, songs only a village like Willowbrook would remember. The next morning brought a hush even deeper than usual. It was the day of the harvest festival. A gentle frost had touched the tips of the grass overnight, leaving silver traces that sparkled in the early sunlight. Smoke curled from chimneys across the village as ovens were lit and soup pots warmed. Eleanor rose earlier than normal, stirred by a kind of quiet excitement she hadn't felt in years. She dressed slowly, choosing a deep burgundy shawl that had once belonged to her sister. It was soft and warm and carried the faintest scent of lavender. She pinned it neatly at her shoulder and added a small copper brooch shaped like a leaf, an old piece, but perfect for the day. Her pie was already cooling on the windowsill, a spiced pumpkin and pecan tart that had taken most of yesterday to prepare. She packed it carefully into a basket, tucking a clean linen cloth around it. Then, after a final glance in the mirror, she stepped out into the glowing morning. The village square had transformed. Children were running between hay bales and woven lantern poles. Musicians were tuning their instruments near the town hall steps. The long tables were being set with hand-stitched cloths and decorated with dried wheat, gourds, and tiny pumpkins. Candles and glass jars lined the stone wall that wrapped around the square, waiting to be lit at sunset. Eleanor was greeted with smiles and nods from every corner. "Morning, Eleanor! Is that your famous pecan tart? Save me a slice, won't you?" She laughed and promised she would. She placed her pie on the dessert table beside a towering apple crumble and a tray of cinnamon rolls. Then she wandered slowly among the booths, her pace unhurried, her gaze lingering on the faces she had come to know over the decades. There was a comfort in how familiar everything was, like rereading a favorite chapter of a book. Later in the day, the sky turned a muted gold. The trees around the village square rustled gently, their branches swaying with the wind as if they too were enjoying the day. Laughter echoed in the alleys. Fiddles and flutes played songs passed down through generations, songs that made the young dance and the old remember. Eleanor sat for a while beneath the old sycamore at the edge of the square. A little girl she didn't know approached her, holding a maple leaf the size of her head. "It's red like your shawl," the girl said, holding it out shyly. Eleanor smiled and took the leaf, pressing it gently between her hands. "Thank you," she said. "It's beautiful. My name's Clara," the girl added, then ran off again, her boots kicking up fallen leaves as she went. Eleanor watched her go, heart quietly warmed by the encounter. As evening approached, lanterns were lit one by one. The soft glow turned the entire square into something magical, flickering and golden, like the village had slipped into another time entirely. People gathered for the final moments of the day, the last round of music, the storytelling near the bonfire, the hush before the stars came out fully. Eleanor found herself beside Maeve and Arthur, sipping warm cider from a clay mug. They talked of small things, the harvest, the weather, the birds already leaving for the south. But there was also something unspoken in the air, a shared awareness of how rare it was to experience a moment so whole, so complete in its simplicity. As the sky deepened into velvet and stars brightened one by one, Eleanor walked home slowly. Lanterns lit her path. The breeze was cooler now, and she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Back in her cottage, she removed her shoes and placed the leaf Clara had given her on the windowsill. She poured herself the last of her tea, opened her journal, and wrote. Today, the world was kind. In small, quiet ways. A pie shared. A leaf given. A song hummed under old trees. If only we could carry days like this in our pockets. She read the entry twice, closed the journal, and sat by the fire until the last candle burned low. Then she climbed into bed, pulled the blanket up to her chin, and let sleep carry her away, soft as the falling leaves, steady as the rhythm of a village in autumn. A few days passed after the harvest festival, and the village began to grow quieter. The laughter that once echoed through the square became softer. The smell of mulled cider and fire-roasted chestnuts lingered only faintly in the air. Leaves continued their slow descent, covering garden paths and cottage roofs in blankets of gold and rust. Morning mist stayed longer now, curling between tree trunks and along fences, as though reluctant to leave. Eleanor felt the shift, not a sadness, but a stillness that came with late autumn. The days grew shorter, the winds cooler. She began lighting her lanterns earlier in the evening and steeping her tea a little longer, as if the warmth needed more time to sink in. One morning, while dusting the old bookshelf in her sitting room, Eleanor found something she hadn't seen in years, a stack of letters bound with twine, tucked behind a row of old gardening guides. Her hands paused mid-motion, and her breath caught slightly. The letters were addressed in a neat, slanted script. The top one read, Miss Eleanor Wren, Hearthstone Cottage, Willowbrook. She sat down slowly, placed the bundle on her lap, and untied the twine. The paper had yellowed slightly, but the ink remained bold. The first letter was dated October 23, 1979. It was from Jonathan. Jonathan had once been part of Willowbrook, briefly, but deeply. He'd arrived one spring to work with the forestry team, tall and quiet, with eyes that watched more than they spoke. He and Eleanor had struck up a friendship that turned, softly, into something more. They spent afternoons walking the orchard trails, talking about books and trees and lives they hadn't lived yet. But Jonathan had to leave. A job offer in the north, something he couldn't refuse. They had promised to write, and for a while they had. But as time passed, the letters grew farther apart, and life carried them in different directions. Eleanor had folded the last of his letters and placed them away, unsure whether to keep hoping or to simply hold the memories gently. She began to read them now, slowly, as though each sentence were a leaf pressed between pages. The woods here aren't like Willowbrook's, he wrote in one. They're colder, quieter. I miss the sound of your kettle and the way the light falls through your kitchen window at dusk. Another letter spoke of dreams, his desire to build a cottage of his own someday, somewhere near the sea. He even sketched it on the back of one page, a small stone house with lavender along the fence and a chimney that curled smoke like a signature. Eleanor read until the fire burned low and the shadows grew long. She didn't cry. She simply held the letters to her chest for a moment, then returned them to their twined bundle, now warmed by touch and time. She placed them back on the shelf, not hidden this time, but visible, like the photograph of her parents on the mantel, or the dried roses above the door. That night, sleep came with dreams. She dreamt she was walking again beside Jonathan, only they were older, her hair streaked with silver, his with soft gray. They didn't speak in the dream. They didn't need to. The wind moved through the tall grasses, and the trees swayed gently overhead, and that was enough. The next morning, Eleanor woke early and walked to Blackberry Ridge again. The wind was sharper now, and clouds gathered low on the horizon. She wore her heaviest coat and carried a thermos of ginger tea. When she reached the top of the hill, she placed a smooth stone on the flat rock where she always sat, a small ritual she had started long ago, one stone for each season passed in peace. She stayed a long while, watching the village below as smoke rose from familiar chimneys. Willowbrook always remained the same, she thought. Not because it never changed, but because it knew how to hold its quiet things dearly. On her way down, she gathered a few dried branches to place on her hearth. At home, she set them beside the fireplace, warmed her hands, and made a stew with root vegetables and thyme. The evening came quickly. She lit her lamps one by one and wrote again in her journal. Some stories never truly end. They settle into the folds of our lives, whispering from time to time like wine through the pines. Not to remind us of what we've lost, but of what we were lucky enough to hold, even for a little while. She closed the book and rested her hands on the table. Outside, the moon rose pale and full above the treetops, and the night was so quiet, she could hear the leaves falling. A few days later, the first snow arrived, not in heavy drifts, but as a light, tentative dusting. It came just before dawn, falling silently over the rooftops and resting gently along the stone paths that wound through Willowbrook. When Eleanor opened her curtains that morning, the world outside was transformed, muted, softened, silenced under a thin veil of white. She stood for a moment, hands wrapped around a warm mug, simply watching. The way the snow settled on the fence posts, the delicate layering on the branches of the birch trees in her garden, it all made the familiar look new again. The first snow always brought something with it. Not just a change in season, but a shift in feeling. A sense that the world had taken a long breath in. Eleanor spent that morning indoors. She added a second log to the fire, pulled her thickest wool socks from the drawer, and lit a candle on her writing desk. The flame flickered gently in the morning light as she reread the pages of her journal from the past weeks. So many small entries, observations, fragments, half-formed thoughts, all linked by a quiet gratitude for the season she was living through. There was something about autumn turning to winter that always made her reflective. Perhaps it was the way the days shortened, or how the hush of snowfall drew attention to the smallest of sounds, the ticking clock, the whisper of a page turning, the soft clink of a spoon against a cup. She spent the afternoon writing letters. One to her niece in the city, full of descriptions of the snow, the harvest festival, and a new recipe for carrot and ginger soup. Another to an old friend in the next village over, inviting her to visit before the year turned. And one more, a letter she didn't intend to send. It was addressed to Jonathan. She didn't write about regrets or mischances. Instead, she described her days exactly as they were. She told him about the Blackberry Path, the children's lantern parade, and the girl named Clara who had given her a leaf. She wrote about how the fire crackled a little differently on rainy nights, how the village square smelled of apples and cloves in late October. And at the end she wrote, "Sometimes I think the past is a place we return to, not with footsteps, but with memory. And sometimes that's enough." She folded the letter carefully, placed it in an envelope, and tucked it inside the back of her journal. That evening, snow began to fall again. Thicker this time. Eleanor bundled up in her coat and shawl and stepped outside. The village was quiet. Lights glowed in the windows of nearby cottages, and faint wisps of chimney smoke disappeared into the falling snow. She walked slowly through the garden gate, down the familiar path that curved toward the stream. The sound of the brook was muffled now, its usual babble hushed by the blanket of snow forming around it. The world felt distant, but not lonely, just paused. As if everything had agreed, silently, to be still. She returned home just as the snow began to stick to her shawl. Inside, the warmth of the fire welcomed her like an old friend. She hung her coat by the door, placed her boots on the mat, and sat near the hearth, rubbing her hands together. Later, she opened a book of poetry and read by the flickering light. The words blurred occasionally, not from sleep, but from a fullness, a kind of contentment that needed no name. At bedtime, she added another blanket to her bed and turned off the lamps one by one. The last light she extinguished was the small candle by the window, the one she always left for a few extra minutes, just in case someone out there needed to know they were remembered. Before sleep came, she whispered to the dark, "Let it snow all night. Let the village dream." And the snow did fall all night, soft, silent, steady. The snow continued over the following days, blanketing Willowbrook in soft silence. By the end of the week, the village looked like a page from an old Christmas card. Roofs were capped in white, window panes laced with delicate frost, and icicles hung like crystal pendants from eaves and fences. Footprints, small and large, dotted the snow-covered paths, crisscrossing toward the bakery, the post office, and back home again. Willowbrook, always gentle, became even more hushed, as if winter had placed a finger to its lips. Eleanor embraced the rhythm. Her mornings began with lighting the fire and watching the flames bloom. She would warm her hands around a mug of strong black tea with a cinnamon stick stirred in, listening to the whisper of snowflakes tapping the window glass. She'd wrap herself in a shawl and sit near the window seat, reading letters or rereading old books, ones whose endings she already knew, but cherished anyway. There was comfort in the known, in the soft return of things. One afternoon, just as she was trimming dried orange slices to hang over the fireplace, there was a knock at the door. Not hurried, not hesitant. A knock like someone who knew how to visit. When she opened it, Clara stood on the stoop, cheeks red, boots damp with snow, and mittens covered in tiny clumps of ice. Behind her stood her mother, Isabel, who offered a sheepish smile. "Clara insisted on bringing you something," she said. "And I thought, well, maybe we could stay for a moment, if that's all right?" Eleanor smiled, already stepping aside. "Of course. Come in, both of you. The kettle's just about to whistle." Inside, Clara handed Eleanor a tiny cloth pouch tied with ribbon. Inside were small hand-cut stars made of dried apple slices and cinnamon sticks. "We made decorations at the school fair," Clara said, "and I made these for you." Eleanor crouched slightly, touched. "They're beautiful. They smell like my kitchen in October." Clara beamed, then wandered over to the fireplace, completely at home. Over tea and walnut scones, Eleanor and Isabel spoke, first of simple things, the snow, the fair, the school. But eventually the conversation drifted to memories, the kind only winter allows space for. Isabel admitted how hard it had been moving back to Willowbrook after her husband passed. How the village seemed too quiet at first. How she wasn't sure if she'd made the right choice. "But Clara," she said, watching her daughter carefully lining pine cones on the rug, "she's blooming here. And sometimes I think maybe Willowbrook doesn't change. Maybe it just waits. For the people who need it most." Eleanor nodded. She knew the feeling. When the visit ended and the door shut softly behind them, the cottage felt different, not emptier, but warmer somehow. The kind of warmth that lingers after voices have faded. That night, Eleanor hung the cinnamon stars in her kitchen window and sat by the fire with her journal open on her lap. She wrote, "A small knock. A small gift. A child's smile beside a fire. How easily the heart remembers what it needs." The snow didn't let up. By mid-December, the trees were bare and the sky held a constant hush. The stream near Eleanor's cottage had frozen over in places, and the children had taken to sliding across it, bundled in scarves and laughter. Inside, Eleanor prepared for the long nights with quiet ceremony. She brought out her old patchwork quilt, added rosemary to her simmering pots, and filled little bowls with dried cloves and orange peels to scent the rooms. Her letters continued, outgoing and incoming. One from her niece described city streets filled with light and motion, the kind of holiday buzz that never quite stopped humming. Another came in an envelope she didn't recognize. It was from Arthur, the bookshop owner. Inside was a short note in his careful, spidery handwriting. I thought of you when this came in. A new collection of poems by someone you once read to me aloud. Consider it an early solstice gift. May the season hold you gently. Arthur. Eleanor smiled as she turned the book over in her hands. The light between trees, the title itself felt like something whispered through snowfall. She spent the evening reading one poem at a time, slowly, letting the space between lines speak as much as the words themselves. She marked the ones she liked with tiny paper slips torn from a grocery list. That night, the wind howled more than usual. But inside, her little cottage remained steady. The fire glowed softly, the cinnamon stars swung slightly in the draft, and the patchwork quilt held the weight of memory and time. And Eleanor, nestled in her armchair with a half-read book resting on her chest, let her eyes close not out of fatigue, but contentment. She slept deeply, as the snow continued its patient, endless fall. As the final week of December approached, Willowbrook began its quiet transformation into winter's full embrace. Though the harvest colors had long faded, replaced by frost-bitten branches and snow-covered eaves, the village never felt bare. Instead, it shimmered in a different kind of beauty, one found in subtle things: the soft glow of candlelight in windows, the trails of footprints pressed into snow like fragile lace, the rising steam from chimneys curling into a pearl-gray sky. Eleanor found these days both still and full. She had grown fond of the slower pace winter demanded. There was no garden to tend now, no outdoor markets or long walks to the ridge. Her world had become smaller, but in that shrinking, she had begun to notice things she might have once passed by. A robin's bright chest against the white snow, the creak of the old floorboard under the window at exactly the same time each afternoon, the way her shadow stretched differently depending on how low the sun sat. On the morning of December 21st, the winter solstice, Eleanor rose just before sunrise. She had a tradition of greeting the shortest day of the year with intention. Not for any mystical reason, but because it reminded her that light, however small, always returned. She lit a single candle and placed it on the windowsill. Outside, the snow reflected the flame's glow, multiplying it softly. She brewed a pot of blackcurrant tea and wrapped herself in a thick wool shawl before sitting near the hearth with a basket of dried herbs, ribbons, and sprigs of pine. She began crafting small bundles, solstice favors, as she called them. Nothing grand, just little bits of nature tied with thoughtfulness. She made 9 in total. Later that morning, she ventured into the village to deliver them. One for Arthur at the bookshop, who placed it beside a stack of new arrivals with a quiet smile. One for Maeve, who tucked it into her coat pocket with misty eyes. One for Isabel and Clara, left gently on their doorstep with a note that read, "For warmth and wonder, always." The remaining bundles found homes along her path, on a neighbor's gate, tucked into a postbox, left on the bench beneath the old town sycamore. By the time Eleanor returned home, the sky had shifted to soft gray, with the faintest promise of more snow. That evening, she made herself a simple stew of lentils, root vegetables, and bay leaf. She ate slowly by the fire, savoring the way the flavors warmed her from the inside out. She did not feel lonely. In fact, there was a fullness to the silence, an awareness that she was part of something that didn't need noise to exist. The village was around her. The memories lived in her home, in the books on her shelf, in the folds of the shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Later, she pulled out a small wooden box from the bottom drawer of her writing desk. Inside were paper snowflakes, each hand-cut and folded, collected over the years from children, neighbors, and even strangers. Some had names and dates written in the corners. Others were anonymous, simple gifts left on her doorstep during past winters. She strung them together on a long thread and hung them across the mantel. Then, With the candle on the windowsill still flickering, she opened her journal and wrote. The quiet is not empty. It is waiting. It is holding. It is remembering everything we forget when the world moves too quickly. And tonight I remember everything. That night, just before sleep, she stepped outside once more. The village was hushed in white. Trees stood like statues, and rooftops shimmered under moonlight. From somewhere far off, the distant sound of bells, perhaps sleigh bells, perhaps wind chimes, floated briefly on the air. Eleanor closed her eyes and listened. She wasn't thinking of the past, nor worrying over the future. She was simply there, in the moment, feet in the snow, breath in the cold, heart steady. And when she returned indoors and slipped beneath the quilt, she didn't need to read, or write, or think. She simply let herself rest. And outside, as the village slept, the longest night of the year slowly turned toward light. The days that followed the solstice were quiet but filled with meaning. Though the nights were still long and the air sharp with frost, there was a subtle change in the way the light returned each morning, a little earlier, a little softer, brushing the tops of snow-laden trees with a golden blush. Eleanor noticed. She always did. New Year's was approaching. Willowbrook didn't celebrate loudly. There were no fireworks or crowded squares. Instead, the villagers honored the changing of the calendar with simple gatherings, shared meals, and handwritten notes tucked into coat pockets or slipped under doors, wishes for the year ahead, folded with care. Eleanor's tradition was her own. On the last morning of the year, she walked to the stream, now mostly frozen, and stood on the small wooden bridge that overlooked the water. In her gloved hand was a piece of parchment. She had written down one thing she wished to carry forward, and one thing she was ready to let go. This year, she had written. To carry forward presents. To release, waiting for what won't return. She folded the parchment, breathed in the cold, pine-scented air, and gently released the paper into the water. It floated for a moment, turning slowly, then drifted beneath the thin crust of ice at the edge. She watched it go with peace, not pain. That evening, Eleanor prepared a small supper for herself, roasted squash, wild rice, and a slice of oat bread with berry preserves. She set the table with a single candle and placed a sprig of cedar beside her plate. It was her way of marking time, acknowledging the end, welcoming the beginning. As the clock neared midnight, she sat by the window with a wool blanket over her knees and her journal in her lap. Outside, snow fell once more, slow and steady, like a lullaby. The village was asleep, save for the occasional glow of lamplight behind distant curtains. She wrote, Another year has passed through me like a river. I have stood still and let it wash over me. I have held what mattered and released what did not. And here I am, once more, whole and quiet and grateful. When the clock chimed 12, Eleanor didn't make a sound. She simply smiled, sipped her tea, and whispered to the dark. Welcome. The early days of January were soft and simple. The snow piled deeper. Icicles grew longer. Eleanor spent her time in gentle routine, reading, baking, tidying drawers she hadn't opened in months. One day she found a small bundle of dried lavender wrapped in silk tucked behind a row of old recipe books. She placed it in a bowl in her bedroom, and its scent perfumed the air like a memory made visible. Letters arrived again. Her niece wrote of planning a visit in spring. Maeve sent a postcard from a weekend trip to a nearby town with a bookstore that, she said, smelled exactly like Arthur's, only with worse coffee. Clara wrote her own note, on thick paper with blue ink. I saw a red fox near the fence today. I think he was watching me. I think he knows secrets. Eleanor pinned the note beside her writing desk. One evening, the sound of footsteps crunched in the snow outside her cottage just as she was placing a log on the fire. When she opened the door, there stood Arthur, bundled in layers and holding a cloth-covered parcel. I brought you something, he said simply. Inside the cloth was a book, bound in deep green leather with gold embossing. On the cover, the winter letters, a collection of correspondence between two friends over 20 winters. Some letters were fictional. Others were real, anonymous pieces collected from journals, archives, and donations. I thought you'd like it, Arthur said. There's something about reading the words people only write in the quiet months. Eleanor was touched. She offered him a chair and warmed some tea. They spoke of the bookshop, of weather patterns, of how the snow made everything feel more important. When Arthur left, he paused by the door and said, almost as an afterthought, "You know, we're all a little better when we're remembered." Eleanor nodded. "We are." That night she began reading the winter letters. She read slowly, savoring every phrase. The letters spoke of longing, of home, of snowstorms and kind strangers and the way candlelight flickers across familiar walls. She read until sleep pulled her gently away, the book resting open across her chest, the fire low and glowing in its final embers. Outside, Willowbrook slept beneath a sky full of stars. And within her cottage, Eleanor dreamed not of what had been, but of what was still to come. Of the soft steps of spring beneath the snow. Of unseen seeds sleeping in frozen ground. Of letters unwritten. Of stories not yet told. That evening, Eleanor sat quietly by the fire, the blue cloth journal still resting in her lap. The flames crackled gently, casting shadows that danced along the wooden beams of the cottage ceiling. Outside, the snow had paused, just for a while, as if the world itself was waiting. The little book Jonathan had sent was now a weight in her hands, not heavy with sorrow, but full of time. She reread the final page once more. If Willowbrook is still there, and you are still there, maybe we'll speak again. Or maybe we'll just share the silence. Sometimes that's enough. It was a kind of answer. A reaching out, not loud, not urgent, but unmistakably real. Like the first bud that appears beneath the frost, knowing spring is still far but already stirring. She placed the journal gently on the side table and picked up her pen. The letter she wrote in return was brief. Willowbrook is still here. The silence is still beautiful. The light is still soft. And yes, I am still here. She didn't know when, or if, he would read it. But she knew it had to be written. The next morning brought a slow, amber light through the windows. Eleanor bundled herself in her warmest shawl and walked to the postbox at the edge of the village, boots crunching softly against packed snow. The letter slid into the wooden box with a quiet finality, and she stood for a moment longer, her gloved hand resting on the lid. Then she turned back toward home. The days that followed were simple. A gentle snow came and went. Clara brought her a drawing of the robin she had seen in the garden. Arthur stopped by with a book of winter haikus and a jar of preserved lemon jam. Maeve, ever the baker, gifted Eleanor a paper-wrapped loaf with clove and orange peel baked into the crust. Eleanor found herself leaning into the rhythm. Each day brought something small, a sound, a flavor, a light pattern across the floor. She noted them in her journal, as always. Today, icicles caught the light and made the fence look like glass. The gingerbread Maeve made reminded me of a Christmas in 1982. Clara said, I think trees talk to each other when we're not listening. I believe her. One evening, as January faded toward February, Eleanor opened Jonathan's journal again. She turned to a page she hadn't noticed before, pressed tightly near the middle, a single dried pine needle tucked between two blank sheets. There was no writing. Just that small, fragile relic of a forest moment. She smiled. She remembered the day they had gathered pine needles to scent the windowsills of Hearthstone Cottage, laughing as the wind stole half their pile. She remembered the way his voice sounded in the woods, soft, never hurried. The way he had said her name like it was part of the landscape. She closed the journal slowly and whispered aloud. You remembered too. By the first days of February, the snow began to melt in patches. Not entirely. Willowbrook would stay wintry for weeks yet, but enough to reveal stones beneath the frost, and blades of stiff brown grass curling upward for the sun. The streams began to murmur again, a low sound like breath returning to a sleeping world. Eleanor began taking longer walks again. The air still nipped at her cheeks, but the sun had a gentler warmth, a promise embedded within the cold. One afternoon, she stood at Blackberry Ridge again. The sky above was pale blue, and clouds floated like feathers. Below, the village breathed its quiet life, smoke rising, rooftops glistening, paths beginning to turn muddy at the edges. She sat on the flat stone and took out her notebook. The thaw has started. I don't know what will come next, but I no longer fear the waiting. By the second week of February, the weather began to shift once again. One late afternoon, the sky turned a dusky violet, the kind of color that only appears when winter is about to remind you it's not finished. A steady wind picked up, rustling the pine trees behind Eleanor's cottage and bending their heavy branches with a slow, groaning creak. The smoke from chimneys no longer rose. It was pulled sideways, as if the air itself was bracing. Eleanor knew the signs. A snowstorm was coming. That evening, she moved through Hearthstone Cottage with quiet purpose. She filled her thermos with hot water, laid out the thickest quilts on her bed, and checked that her lanterns had fresh oil. The balm candles Clara had made were placed in each window, soft amber light ready to greet the dark. The wind howled louder as night fell. Ice tapped against the window panes like cautious fingers. Tree branches swayed and scratched, and the eaves of the house groaned softly under the shifting weight of snow. But inside, Eleanor's world remained still. Safe. Familiar. She sat by the fire and read poetry until sleep pulled at her gently. As she climbed into bed, she whispered to herself, "Let the storm come. We've weathered worse." By morning, the storm had passed. But everything had changed. The village was buried beneath a thick white silence. Footpaths had vanished. Fences were swallowed. Trees wore heavy coats of snow, and the rooftops sagged under its weight. From her bedroom window, Eleanor could see only a smooth, unbroken landscape, like the world had been tucked beneath a great white quilt. She boiled water for tea and lit the stove. Outside, the sunlight was beginning to break through the clouds, scattering gold across the snow and making it glitter like sugar. The storm had taken much, but it had left beauty. After breakfast, Eleanor pulled on her boots and stepped into the deep snow. Each step was slow, deliberate, and left behind a perfectly shaped imprint. She didn't walk far, just to the edge of her garden, where the snow had piled nearly to her waist. She stood there, breathing in the cold. The air was so still it almost didn't feel real. No birdsong. No wind. Only the faint sound of dripping icicles and her own breath. She whispered aloud, to no one in particular. "Sometimes it takes a storm to see the world clearly again." That afternoon, she received a letter. Tucked into the small metal box near the gate, half buried in snow, was a plain white envelope. She brought it inside, brushed off the flakes, and opened it with chilled fingers. The handwriting was unmistakable. Slanted. Careful. Familiar. Jonathan. Asterisk. I wasn't sure if I should write again, but I've been walking through snow-covered woods lately, and everything reminds me of Willowbrook. Of blackberry paths, of pine needles on your windowsill. Of your silence when it said more than words ever could. If I came to visit, would you still have tea waiting? Asterisk. Eleanor read the note twice. Then again. She folded it carefully, placed it inside her journal, and looked out the window at the garden, where her single trail of footsteps stood out against the unbroken snow. She smiled faintly, then reached for a fresh piece of paper. Eleanor placed Jonathan's letter on the mantel, beside the small bowl of dried pine cones and lavender. She didn't reply immediately, not because she didn't know what to say, but because she wanted to let the question settle. Would she still have tea waiting? It wasn't just a question about tea, of course. It was about time. About forgiveness. About whether silence could be shared by two people after so many years, and still feel like home. She made a pot of chamomile and sat by the window. The snow outside had begun to melt just slightly, revealing the curved tips of her garden fence. The icicles were dripping now, in slow, steady rhythm, like the ticking of a patient clock. She thought of all the letters they hadn't sent. All the winters passed without word. And yet, here it was. A return. A possibility. That evening, Eleanor finally replied. Her letter was brief, like his. Yes. The kettle is warm. The fire is kind. The chair by the window still waits for you. If you come, come as you are. No explanations needed. Just presence. She posted it the next morning. The path to the village had cleared just enough for walking, though patches of snow still reached her knees. As she made her way through the hushed woods, the sun filtered through the thinning branches, casting long, slanting shadows on the ground. Arthur saw her at the post office. He gave a soft smile and tipped his hat. "Riding old ghosts?" he asked gently. Eleanor smiled. "Something like that." Days passed, and Willowbrook stirred from winter's deep hush. Children's laughter returned to the village square, muffled through scarves and snow boots. Maeve reopened the bakery 2 days a week, her windows fogged with steam from rising bread. The frozen stream began to murmur again, and birds returned, tentative at first, then bold. Eleanor's cottage warmed too, not from fire alone, but from expectation. She dusted the guest room, aired the linens, placed a small vase of dried wildflowers by the window. Not for decoration, but for memory. The day he arrived, she knew before the knock came. She had been folding a wool blanket in the sitting room when something shifted in the air. A rhythm, a stillness, an old echo returning. Then, softly, 3 knocks. Not loud. Not unsure. Just present. When she opened the door, Jonathan stood there, hat in hand, snow on his shoulders. His hair was more silver now, and lines traced gently around his eyes. But his presence, calm, solid, was the same. They didn't speak at first. They simply looked at one another. Then Eleanor stepped aside. "Come in," she said. "It's cold." Inside, the warmth greeted him. The scent of cedarwood, cinnamon, and old paper. The crackling fire. The soft ticking of the wall clock. He stepped in slowly, like returning to a room in a dream. "I almost didn't come," he said quietly. "I know," she replied. "But you did." She poured tea into the same ceramic cups they'd once used decades ago. He noticed. "You kept them. Some things don't break, even if they're put away." They sat near the hearth, the silence between them no longer heavy, but layered, like snowfall that covers something precious without hiding it. He took a sip of tea, then looked up. "I've walked through so many winters since the last time I saw this place." "And did they lead you back?" she asked. "I think they never stopped leading me here." That night, he stayed in the guest room. Eleanor placed an extra quilt at the foot of the bed and a book of winter poetry on the bedside table. She lit a candle and left the door ajar, just slightly. As she climbed into bed, she could hear the wind outside beginning to stir again. But inside, everything was still. The days that followed moved gently. They took walks together, slow and unhurried, through the same trails they'd once known by heart. Blackberry Ridge. The mossy path behind the orchard. The stone bridge where she once released her parchment on New Year's Eve. They didn't talk about the years they'd missed. Not much. Instead, they shared the now, the way snow clung to the trees, the soft smell of the woods in thaw, the birds returning, one song at a time. Eleanor, writing in her journal one evening, summed it up simply. "Some returns are not grand. They are quiet arrivals, like light returning to a room that was never dark, only waiting." The snow melted slowly, respectfully. It didn't vanish all at once but receded gently, retreating from the edges of stone walls, releasing fence posts from its grip, uncovering the dark, damp earth with patient hands. Where the garden had slept beneath a heavy white quilt, now tufts of green began to push through. Crocus and snowdrops, tentative at first, then bolder. Inside Hearthstone Cottage, the mood changed too. The windows stayed open longer, even if just a crack. Fresh air carried the scent of moss, soil, and something else, possibility. Eleanor had begun placing small vases of early spring flowers on the windowsills. She returned to baking, oat scones with rosemary, apple crisps with cinnamon, the smell curling through the hallways like a memory remembered at the perfect time. Jonathan had settled into the rhythm quietly. He didn't overstay or overstep. He walked in the mornings, helped Eleanor carry firewood in the afternoons, and in the evenings, They often sat across from each other reading in silence, the occasional "Listen to this one" drifting between them like birdsong. They had fallen into something rare, a shared solitude. One morning, Eleanor awoke to the sound of laughter in the garden. She pulled her shawl around her shoulders and peeked through the curtain. There, in the dewy grass, Clara was chasing Jonathan with a bundle of sticks in her arms. He was pretending to be an old tree spirit, growling softly, his hands curled like branches. Isabel stood nearby, watching with a smile and shaking her head. Eleanor joined them moments later, warm mugs in hand. Clara looked up, grinning. "He's really fast for someone who says he's made of bark." "I said I feel like bark," Jonathan replied, catching his breath. "Not that I run like it." They laughed, and for the first time in many years, Eleanor laughed too. Not a polite, passing laugh, but the kind that lifts from the ribs, light and clear and rooted in something honest. That evening, after the sun had dipped below the ridge and cast long shadows across the village, Eleanor brought out a box she hadn't touched in years. It was tucked at the back of her wardrobe, under quilts and scarves. Inside were photos, letters, a pressed daisy, a pair of train tickets from a trip never taken. Jonathan sat beside her, not asking, not rushing, just waiting. She passed him one of the photos. It was of them, many years ago. They were standing at the Willowbrook fair, wind in her hair, a book in his hand. His arm was looped loosely around her shoulders, as if unsure whether to hold on or let go. He ran his fingers along the edge of the photo. "I remember that wind," he said quietly. Eleanor nodded. "It almost took my hat. But you let it," he added. They smiled. There were silences that asked for filling. This one didn't. In the weeks that followed, Clara began visiting more often. Sometimes with questions about birds or stars, or whether trees remembered people. Other times, just to sit near the fireplace and draw. Jonathan watched her once from across the room and said, "She sees the world the way poets do. But instead of words, she uses color. She reminds me of you," Eleanor replied. Clara turned, as if sensing it. "I remind you of what?" "Of spring," Eleanor said. "Unexpected. Quiet. Alive." Clara smiled and returned to her sketchbook. March gave way to April, and with it came a full transformation. The stream ran fast now, its voice louder with each thawed bend. Birds returned in chorus, building nests in the old trees by the garden. The cottage filled with soft, golden light that lasted into the evening. One afternoon, Eleanor and Jonathan stood beneath the apple tree out back. Its branches, still bare, held the promise of blossoms. Jonathan reached up and touched one limb lightly. "I think it'll bloom early this year." Eleanor looked at him, sunlight catching in her silvered hair. "And if it does? Then we sit beneath it," he said. "And we read poems. And pretend we have all the time in the world." That evening, as dusk turned the sky to lavender, Eleanor wrote in her journal, "Love does not always return as it was. Sometimes it comes back as something gentler. Not urgent, not burning, but warm. A fire with no smoke. A hand that does not grip. Just presence." She closed the journal and looked across the room. Jonathan had fallen asleep in the armchair, glasses slipping down his nose, a book open across his chest. Outside, the apple tree waited. And inside, for the first time in many years, Eleanor no longer did. The days stretched longer now, as April slowly melted into May. The air carried a softness, a sweet perfume of budding flowers, damp earth, and fresh grass that had finally shaken off winter's grasp. Willowbrook itself seemed to breathe in the new season, waking from its slumber with cautious hope. Windows flung open, curtains fluttering like gentle waves, and the village's slow rhythm quickened just a touch. Inside Hearthstone Cottage, Eleanor and Jonathan settled into their renewed companionship like old friends rekindling a long-lost conversation. Mornings were spent tending to the small garden patches Eleanor had begun planting weeks before. She showed Jonathan how to press soil gently around tender shoots of herbs, chamomile, thyme, and lavender. He listened with quiet fascination, his hands hesitant at first, then steadier as he joined her in coaxing life from the earth. Afternoons were often for reading. They sat near the large window that faced the ridge, sunlight pooling around their feet. Eleanor's journal lay open between them, and Jonathan read aloud from the pages, his voice low and steady. "The thaw is a promise, whispered not in thunder but in the slow drip of melting snow, in the tender first crocus that pushes through the frost. It says, endure. Wait. Bloom." One day, Clara appeared at the doorstep, her arms filled with wildflowers and a carefully wrapped bundle of fresh herbs. "I gathered these from the woods," she said, cheeks flushed. "I thought you might want to make tea." Eleanor smiled and took the gifts gratefully. "Thank you, Clara. That's very thoughtful." Jonathan nodded in agreement. "You have a good eye for the quiet gifts of the forest." The three of them spent the afternoon outside, weaving small wreaths of wildflowers and herbs to hang in the cottage windows. The scent of pine and lavender mingled with the fresh earth beneath their fingers, and the simple act felt like a renewal, a small celebration of belonging. As May deepened, a special event approached in Willowbrook, the annual spring festival. Unlike bustling town fairs, this was a modest gathering. Villagers brought homemade pies, hand-carved wooden crafts, and stories from the winter months. Children performed simple plays in the square, and neighbors exchanged recipes alongside laughter. Eleanor hadn't attended the festival in years, but this year was different. With Jonathan by her side and Clara's gentle encouragement, she decided to join the celebration. The morning of the festival dawned bright and clear. Eleanor dressed in her warmest shawl, and Jonathan donned a tweed jacket that had belonged to his father. Clara wore a wreath of daisies in her hair. At the square, the scent of freshly baked bread and sweet pastries filled the air. The wooden tables groaned under the weight of pies and preserves, and lanterns hung from the trees, waiting to glow as dusk settled. Eleanor found herself talking with neighbors she hadn't seen since before the winter. Arthur from the bookshop was there, reading poetry aloud near the oak tree. Maeve's bakery table was laden with raspberry tarts and honey cakes. The villagers smiled and welcomed Eleanor warmly, as if no time had passed at all. Later, she and Jonathan wandered to the edge of the square, near the small stage where children rehearsed their play. "Do you remember when we used to watch this?" Eleanor asked softly. Jonathan smiled. "I do. The village has a way of holding memories like secrets in the soil." Clara approached, holding a basket of freshly picked wildflowers. "Would you like to see our play?" she asked shyly. Eleanor nodded, touched by the invitation. As the children performed, their voices clear and bright, Eleanor felt a fullness she hadn't known she'd missed, the sense of belonging. Of roots growing deeper. That night, back at Hearthstone Cottage, Eleanor wrote in her journal, "Spring is more than just a season. It is a gentle invitation to live again, to forgive, to hope. In the quiet bloom of flowers and the laughter of children, I find a home." Jonathan looked over her shoulder and whispered, "It's a beautiful thought." She smiled, reaching for his hand. The days that followed were filled with soft routines and quiet discoveries. They planted a small apple tree in the garden, its slender branches reaching toward the sky like hopeful fingers. Eleanor found herself humming old songs while working, the melodies drifting through open windows. Clara visited often, bringing sketches and stories of the woods. Sometimes, they would sit together in the evening light, sharing dreams and secrets beneath the boughs of the ancient trees that cradled Willowbrook. One afternoon, as Eleanor and Jonathan sat beneath the blossoming apple tree, he spoke quietly. "Do you ever think about what comes next?" She looked up at the pink and white petals fluttering like delicate promises. "I think," she said slowly, "that what comes next is whatever we choose to grow." Jonathan smiled, his eyes reflecting the warm light of late afternoon. And so, life at Hearthstone Cottage blossomed alongside the turning seasons. The past was never far, etched in memories and photographs, letters and old songs, but it no longer weighed heavy. Instead, it nourished the soil beneath new beginnings. And as spring deepened into summer, Eleanor knew that whatever waited ahead, she would face it wrapped in light, presence, and quiet love. As May's soft warmth yielded to the longer, golden days of June, Willowbrook hummed with a gentle vitality. The orchard behind Eleanor's cottage burst into full bloom. White and pale pink petals covered the trees like delicate clouds, their sweet fragrance drifting on the breeze and settling into the corners of every room. Bees buzzed busily among the blossoms, and the distant murmur of the stream grew louder, a steady lullaby beneath the vibrant green canopy. Eleanor and Jonathan found themselves outside more and more, their days stretching lazily between garden work, quiet walks, and long talks on the weathered porch. One afternoon, as the sun leaned low and painted the sky with hues of rose and gold, Clara joined them beneath the apple tree. She was carrying a basket woven from willow branches, filled with freshly picked elderflowers and wild strawberries. "I thought we could make some cordials," she said, smiling shyly. Jonathan reached out and took a strawberry, biting into its sweetness. "You have a talent for gathering summer's gifts," he said softly. Clara blushed. "I'd just like to find beauty where others might not notice." Eleanor watched them, a warmth blooming in her chest, not just for the flowers or the fruit, but for this slow, unfolding connection between them all. Summer in Willowbrook was gentle but full. The village held its annual midsummer gathering in the small meadow by the old stone bridge. It was a tradition dating back generations, marked by lanterns hung from tree branches, folk songs sung beneath the open sky, and a bonfire that cracked and sparked as night deepened. This year, Eleanor and Jonathan attended together. Clara performed a small dance near the fire, her movements light and joyful, a celebration of youth and nature's endless cycle. Eleanor clapped along with the others, feeling the pulse of community around her, the quiet thread that tied her past, present, and future. Later, Jonathan and Eleanor found themselves alone by the stream. The moon rose, silver and soft, casting shimmering ribbons of light over the water's surface. Jonathan took Eleanor's hand in his. "I never thought I'd be here again," he said quietly. "Not like this." Eleanor squeezed his hand gently. "Neither did I. But here we are." They sat in companionable silence, listening to the river's song and the whisper of summer leaves. Days turned to weeks. Clara's visits became more frequent and longer. She brought with her sketches filled with swirling colors and delicate lines, capturing the light in ways words could not. Sometimes she and Eleanor would sit together on the porch, sharing stories and dreams, weaving new memories into the fabric of their lives. One evening, as fireflies danced through the dusk, Clara shared a secret. "There's a clearing deep in the woods," she said softly. "A place where the sunlight filters like gold through the trees. I want to take you both there sometime." Eleanor and Jonathan exchanged a glance, a quiet understanding passing between them. "Then we will go," Eleanor said. "When the time is right." Summer's fullness carried them gently forward. The apple tree they had planted earlier was growing steadily, its branches now heavy with small, unripe fruit. The garden bloomed around it, herbs, flowers, vegetables, all nurtured by careful hands and quiet love. And inside Hearthstone Cottage, evenings settled with warmth and peace. Eleanor often wrote in her journal, her pen moving with a steady rhythm. "Summer is a song of light and shadow, of growth and stillness. It teaches me that life is not just about waiting, but about blooming when the moment calls." Jonathan read over her shoulder one night and smiled. "Beautiful," he said. "Just like you." She laughed softly. As the sun set later each day, painting the sky in shades of amber and lavender, Eleanor knew she had found something precious. Not just a season, or a place, but a home for her heart. And as the world around her turned slowly from spring to summer, she felt, for the first time in many years, truly at peace. As summer stretched toward its final days, Eleanor, Jonathan, and Clara finally walked together to the secret clearing deep in the woods, a place Clara had whispered about, where sunlight filtered like liquid gold and the world felt untouched by time. They arrived just as the afternoon light softened, the air rich with the scent of wildflowers and moss. The clearing was a quiet sanctuary, a hidden heart of the forest where the tall trees arched protectively overhead, and the soft earth was carpeted with delicate ferns. Eleanor sat on a fallen log, breathing deeply, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face and the gentle presence of her two companions beside her. Jonathan reached out, taking her hand, and Clara settled close, her sketchbook resting in her lap. No words were needed. Here, in this perfect stillness, time folded gently around them, past, present, and future woven into a single, shining moment. Eleanor smiled softly, eyes closing to the hum of the forest. Home. The end.